Hey everyone, we're back again with another video. Curtis and I are going to be working on the 1970 Triumph TR6R, also known as the Sunset Tripper. And in today's video, we're going to remove the rear wheel. We're going to inspect and replace all worn parts, and then we're going to put the wheel assembly back on the motorcycle. So if you guys are rebuilding a Triumph rear wheel or working on a Triumph motorcycle, feel free to watch today's video. Just a quick heads up, this is not a how-to video. There's many different ways to rebuild a rear wheel. Find the best way that works for you, as we did for us. All right, let's get our hands dirty. So I'm going to have Curtis start working on the drive chain. Curtis is going to remove the master link so he can disconnect both sides of the chain. After he disconnects the chain, he's going to start working on loosening the brake adjuster. Once the adjuster has been loosened and removed, Curtis is also going to loosen the nut that retains the brake plate anchor strap. Now that the strap nut is loose, we're going to also loosen the nut for the chain guard. The chain guard is held down towards the very back, as what you see. Once you loosen the nut, the entire chain guard assembly is going to pivot like a hinge, and then you can lift the chain guard up to be able to remove the entire wheel. Now we're going to move to the timing side or right-hand side of the motorcycle. I'm going to have Curtis remove the nut that retains the speedo cable to the speedo drive. Grabbing the 1 1/8 wrench off the wall, I'm going to have Curtis loosen and remove both sides of the axle nuts. So he's going to work on the drive side, then he's going to work on the timing side. Once the nuts have been loosened and removed, the entire wheel assembly is ready to come off the motorcycle. After showing off his pink gloves in the other video, Curtis wants to show us how strong he is by lifting this rear wheel. Now that the wheel is off the bike, we can visually go over the entire wheel and figure out what needs to be replaced. To be able to remove the entire brake plate assembly, we're going to have to remove the inside nuts that retain the brake plate and the speedo drive. Once you remove both sides of the nuts, you're able to remove the speedo drive, brake plate, and push the axle all the way through. Upon removing the brake plate, there's not a doubt in my mind that we'll have to replace both the brake shoes and the brake drum. Based off what I see, there's a lot of oil buildup, there's a lot of grease, and there is very heavy gouges in the brake drums. So with that being said, we'll get all of our parts ready and expect to replace all these components. Next up, we're going to prepare the wheel to remove the tire. So Curtis is going to remove all the rim locks, valve stem nut, and remove all the air from the tire. I'm going to have Curtis put his weight on the tire so he can break the seal, also known as breaking the bead. Now that the old tire is off the rim, we're going to install a new rim strip. The rim strip is going to protect the tube from being punctured by the nipples. With some elbow grease between the both of us, Curtis and I were able to install the tire off camera. We decided to go with the stock tire, which would have been a Dunlop K70 gold seal tire. This is the same tire that would have came with the motorcycle from the dealership and most likely from the factory. Now that the tire has been installed on the rim, I'm going to have Curtis install a new heavy-duty tube. After the tube is installed, I'm going to have Curtis go to the air compressor so he can put air in the tire to make sure that number one, we didn't pinch the tube, and number two, that the tire is actually seated all the way around the rim. Okay, the next step is very important. We're going to balance the wheel assembly. As you might notice, I haven't replaced the wheel bearings, and I decided to keep the stock wheel bearings for this process simply because the bearings are somewhat worn, but there's no friction. So with this tire having 2 rim locks and a valve stem, it is very important that you spend the time to balance a tire. And as you can see based off the video, the tire is pretty far off. Prior to installing our stick-on wheel weights, I'm going to have Curtis clean the rim off with a rag and acetone. After that, we're going to start sticking on the wheel weight so we can figure out just how much weight we need to make the tire perfectly balanced. Now that the wheel has been properly balanced, we're going to work on removing the brake drum from the hub and the sprocket. The sprocket has minimal wear, but not enough wear to prompt me to replace it. However, the brake drum is worn, and we do know that we're going to replace it. So right now, we're going to use our power drill to remove the sprocket and also the brake drum from the hub. Now that the hub is out of the way, we're going to use a special spanner tool that we also sell on our website. This tool will allow you to remove the bearing locking ring. Once the ring has been removed, we're going to go to the opposite side, which is the timing side, and remove the ring that drives the speedometer drive. Just a heads up, if you're removing or installing the ring, always keep in mind that the speedometer drive ring is a left-hand thread. Using a slide hammer, Curtis was able to remove the ball bearing and the inner dust cover shield. Once that was removed, he flipped the wheel around and used a socket and an adapter to be able to drive the opposite side bearing. Once the bearings were extracted, we noticed that the hub was packed full of grease, so we went ahead and just focused on where the bearings are going to be at and left the grease in the center. Now that all the components have been cleaned and we have 2 replacement parts for the ball bearing, we're essentially going to reverse the disassembly process, and we're going to start assembling the timing side first. One of the most popular ways to damage a hub is to simply use a socket or a drift and drive a bearing in. If the bearing does not go in square, then you could typically broach or damage the housing that the bearing sits in. So what I'm going to be doing is using a custom bearing puller tool that I made a few years back. We're going to install some Sun and Press Fit oil on both of the journals in the hub, and we're going to be able to draw in both of the bearings at the same time. Notice when I insert the drawbar in the hub that I have to insert the spacer, because once the spacer is in place, you can only draw it in at one side. Now that we have our bearing resting on the timing side and we have all the internal pieces in the hub, we're going to get our drive side bearing, and then we're going to get our draw tool and be able to draw the bearings in at the same time. Notice my clockwise rotation of the wrench. This is drawing the bearings in evenly, and most importantly, the bearings are going in square. A quick inspection, we find that the drive side bearing and the timing side bearing are installed to the proper depth. Everything looks good. Let's move forward. Now we're going to focus our attention to the bearing locking ring. The bearing locking ring does have a grub screw that basically pinches the threads to prevent it from coming undone. However, these locking rings are notorious for coming loose, so I have Curtis just install a little bit of Loctite to be able to hold it in place. Moving to the opposite side of the bike, I'm having Curtis install the proper shim, a little bit of Loctite for the Speedo drive ring, tighten it up, and it should be good to go. Remember, it is a left-hand thread. Don't forget that, you guys. Compliments of my company, CBS. Here's some new motorcycle parts we'll be installing. A genuine motorcycle chain made by Reynolds, Ferroto brake shoes, and a new MGO brake drum. So here's all the new parts that we will be installing on the motorcycle. Let's get them installed and move forward. Using a rag, I'm going to quickly clean the surface area to where the brake drum will meet the hub. You want to make sure that it's clean, there's no debris, there's no paint. The reason why is because you want the brake drum to properly seat on the hub. If there's any debris, it could throw it off sideways and you could possibly get run out. Now that the brake drum is on the brake hub, we're going to start to install all the original hardware. So there's a total of 8 bolts and 8 nuts that have to be put in place. Kind of an awkward situation with your hands trying to reach in the back of the drum, but if you spend the time and you're very patient, you'll be able to get all the components back on the brake drum. Now that the brake drum is torqued to the hub, we're going to use our power drill to remove the 8 bolts that came with the new MGO brake drum. Once the hardware has been removed, we're going to get our original sprocket, offer it to the new MGO brake drum. Then we're going to use the hardware that's been supplied with the brake drum and torque that all the way around. Now that the wheel assembly is complete, we're going to focus our attention on the brake plate. As you can see here, this brake plate has seen better days, so I'm going to have Curtis remove the brake shoes and springs from the brake plate assembly. Now that the brake shoes are out of the way, Curtis is going to loosen the nut to be able to remove the brake arm. But before he removes the brake arm, I told Curtis to use a center punch so he can center punch the brake arm and the cam. So essentially what he's doing here is indexing it, which will be a lot easier and help upon assembly. With the little components that we have left to install, I'm going to have Curtis go back to the cleaning tank and clean all the hardware to remove any type of dirt, oil, and debris that's still left behind. With all the components clean, we're going to blow everything off with the air compressor. Once we're done with that, we're going to go back in the workshop and start working on the brake plate. As stated earlier, the Sunset Tripper is going to be getting a new pair of shoes. These are made by Ferroto and they're made in Italy. Now that we have the brake shoes selected, we're going to start working on the brake plate. I'm going to have Curtis lubricate the cam actuator. So he's going to lubricate the stem, and he's also going to lubricate the actual cam and the pin on the opposite side of the brake plate. Obviously, you do not want too much grease, so if you have a lot of grease left behind, just get a towel, wipe everything up to be able to prevent oil and grease from getting on the brake shoes. I highly recommend taking a look at your brake shoes before you install them. There is a leading and trailing edge on these shoes, which is why there's 2 different part numbers. One is 371406 and 371407. So if you do encounter these brake shoes, please keep in mind and please identify that before you install them to save a lot of trouble down the road. Now that the shoes are installed, Curtis is going to apply some grease to the springs to prevent any type of rust and corrosion. Typically, the axle is a slip fit in the bearings. Sometimes you might have to tap on it to get it started, but for the most part, it should be able to slide in place. After the axle is in place, you're going to install your inner spacer. After that, I recommended Curtis to get some brake cleaner and a towel to be able to clean the inside of the brake drum surface prior to installing our brake plate and new brake shoes. Now that the brake drum surface is clean, we're going to grab our brake plate with our new Ferroto shoes and we're going to install it into the drum. Once it's installed, we're going to grab our inner nut, thread it on the shaft, just snug, just to make sure that the brake plate doesn't fall off. Moving to the other side of the wheel, we're going to grab our speedometer drive spacer. Then we're going to grab our speedometer drive and insert it over the speedometer drive ring. Once it's in place, we're going to grab our locking nut, thread it on the speedo drive, make sure it's nice and snug. Then we're going to move forward to the next step. Now that the entire rear wheel is complete, we're going to offer it to the swing arm. And essentially what we're going to do now is reverse the disassembly process. Our last task before we call this job complete is to install the Renault motorcycle chain. This is a 530 chain, 110 links, so we will have to cut it to size. Once the chain has been cut, we're going to go over all of our fasteners, nuts, and bolts to make sure everything is tight and secure before we take the bike down off the lift and for a test ride. All right, you guys, that's going to wrap up today's video. If you guys have any questions or concerns, you can always leave us a comment down towards the bottom of the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you guys own a vintage Triumph, BSA, or Norton motorcycle, check out our website, classicbritishspares.com. You can also follow us on Instagram and on Facebook at Classic British Spares. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys have a great week.